There was a movie that many people have heard of called Sideways that introduced me to the Santa Ynez Valley. 80 something percent of the wineries in this area are made by family owned wineries who make fewer than 10,000 cases a year. Those to me are the hidden gems of this valley. And so I would search out producers like Story of Soil and Dragonette and Future Perfect. And I would stay in Solvang, which is this funny little Danish enclave that was established a little over 100 years ago. It's really charming and lovely. It's this town of half-timbered buildings and windmills and stork's nests and very authentic Danish bakeries. And it's a good home base for exploring the region.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 222. What did John the Baptist, Dom Pérignon, and Saint Vincent all have in common when it comes to wine? What makes the vineyard of Clos de Vougeot in Burgundy so fascinating? And why should you consider visiting the wine region Santa Ynez in Santa Barbara County? You'll hear those tips and stories in part 2 of my chat with Adam McHugh, author of Blood from Stone, a memoir of how wine brought me back from the dead. You don't need to have listened to part 1 from last week first, but I hope you'll go back if you missed it after you finish this one. And just a reminder that 3 of you are going to win signed copies of this book. All you have to do is email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com to let me know you want to win. Now a quick update on my upcoming memoir, Wine Witch on Fire, Rising from the Ashes of Divorce, Defamation, and Drinking Too Much. Well, my book baby went to the printer last week. Holy smokes. I had the same feelings as when my son went off to university. Some sniffles, pride, etc. I now know it's out of my hands and it's being shaped by the presses and ink and paper that will give it its final form. And that's exciting and terrifying. So I won't have the books until mid to late March. The publication date is officially May 9th in Canada and June 6th in the US and worldwide. Yay! Until then, I'm heads down on trying to drum up some media interest in the book. If you're in the media or you know someone who knows someone who is in TV, radio, newspapers, magazines, podcasts, or websites that are in any way related to food, drink, or books, memoir, writing, online bullying, women's issues, entrepreneurship, mental health, self-care, relationships, or divorce, and I'm sure there's other topics, please let me know. I'm also interested in connecting with influencers in any of these categories who are on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, or other social media channels or platforms. Every little bit helps, especially when there are 2,700 books published every day. It's really hard for a book to break even, let alone break out. I hope to hear from you at natalie@nataliemclean.com with any suggestions you have. All right. Here's a review from Terry Vipond, a beta reader from Ottawa. So many experiences described in this book mirrored my own split. I wish this book was around during that time. It's like that one person who understands exactly what you're going through at a time when your married and single friends, try as they might, just can't relate. Natalie has written a masterclass on navigating divorce and heartbreak and learning how to move on to find true contentment. As a wine enthusiast, I'll be giving much more respect and attention to female reviewers and giving much less time to male reviewers. Oh, don't do that, Terry. I'll also be looking deeper at the backstory of wine producers, and again with a focus on strong female lead endeavors. On a personal note, it's a great reminder that a path to healing is not linear. By continuing to reflect on our character strengths and weaknesses, and most of all, learning to forgive ourselves, it creates the space for love to re-enter our lives. That's lovely. By standing in our authenticity, we can take on anything that comes our way. I really loved when the story flowed into the historical accounts of women who were persecuted as witches. I thought it brought extra magic and depth to the story. I also really liked how this flowed into spotlights on women wine producers around the world. These backstories really highlight Natalie's prowess in wine and elevate her reviews beyond her super tasting ability. I definitely give it 5 stars. Thank you, Terry. By the way, now that the book has gone to the printer, I am still looking for early readers. So these are not beta readers who are more involved in editing, but rather those who are willing to just read the book and give me a sentence or two at the end on what they thought about it. If that's you, please let me know at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I've posted a link to the blog post called Diary of a Book Launch in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/222. This is where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about the journey of taking this memoir from idea to publication. Okay, on with the show. We tend to think of French oak imparting vanilla and spice, but American oak sort of sweet coconut notes. Is that just the nature of the trees themselves, or is there any other reason? Is it that looser grain, or I don't know if you know?
It's all white oak, but it's actually like American oak is a different subspecies of white oak than the French oak. And so my guess would be it's different chemical compounds within the wood that's released through the toasting process. It's a generalization, but yeah, French oak is known for vanilla, anise, like spice notes like that, whereas American oak is coconut and dill. I always pick up a dill note like in Rioja, which I think comes from American oak, but it's probably just different chemical compounds.
Interesting. And if you've just joined us, welcome to the Oak Show. Anyway, I'll wrap up my oaky questions right now and get back to sort of the more religious aspects of your memoir. It just struck me, but I could be wrong, that it was more the Catholics who cultivated the vineyards back in the day than the Protestants. Was that because, I don't know, let me just speculate and then you can correct me. The Catholics believed that it was an expression of God's love, whereas the Protestants tended to abstain, the Protestant work ethic. Catholics, well, I do remember from Mass, this is the blood of Christ. It's not a symbol. Like they were more literal, maybe less metaphorically minded. Do you know why the Catholics tended to be cultivating the vineyards?
It's probably even more simple than that. It's that there weren't any Protestants until the 16th century. So throughout the Middle Ages,
there you go.
When all the monastic orders, especially the, Benedictine and the Cistercian monks were the ones that cultivated the great vineyards after the fall of the Roman Empire. They were sort of entrusted with the vineyards that Rome had once planted and tended. And so, but until, Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses like in the 1500s. And so, but then after that, I would say that Protestantism was more of a intellectual and theological movement. And I think we've lost in a lot of ways sort of the earthy spirituality that some of those monastic orders had, and the great vineyards of Burgundy were pretty much all planted and tended by like Cistercian monks and historically. But I loved how they interwove like prayer and devotion and reading and preaching with backbreaking labor as well, and the invention of a great deal of technology as well. Whereas the Protestant movement has been more traditionally an intellectual movement. And then as you get later into like American Protestantism, it's a very like teetotaling culture in a lot of different ways. And so in some ways I feel like more connected to a Catholic sort of understanding of wine and spirituality than I do to sort of the Protestant sort of fear about it. And that's a vast generalization because there's lots of Protestants that are like Episcopalians that are very into wine, but that's kind of the way you could paint it.
Well, yeah, I love that whole integration of mind, body, and soul with the monks praying and then out there tilling the vineyards or whatever they were doing. Tell us about the most famous 100 acres the Cistercians tended, Clos de Vougeot, for 250 years, I think you said. Why was this vineyard so special?
Well, for one thing, it was big. I think it was even 125
Right.
acres,
And it was in
actually,
Burgundy, I should
which,
say. Yeah.
in Burgundy, the 125 acres is massive. And the
Hmm.
monks would enclose many of the great vineyards with what's called a clos, small stone wall. It essentially cloistered the vineyards that had these distinctive expressions or were considered the best. But Clos de Vougeot is interesting from a modern perspective because anyone that knows Burgundy, and I'm, as we all are learning more and more about Burgundy because it's so complicated. Clos de Vougeot, it really depends on the different producer that's making the wine because there's actually so many different terroirs within those 125 acres. It's, has a big stone wall around it, but
Mm.
it's far from a monolith. And so it's all Grand Cru, but I've heard many people say that truthfully, in terms of quality, there are parts of it that are Premier Cru or even village level. And then there are parts of it that, make some of the best wine in the world. But it's interesting. It probably had more to do with like ownership or sort of how it was bequeathed to them that got it enclosed because there's actually so much variety within Clos de Vougeot.
Hmm. And I may have my historical facts wrong, but as I understand it, Napoleon sort of took the vineyards away from the religious orders, didn't have primogeniture, meaning the first son got everything the way they did in Bordeaux. So the Clos de Vougeot, like there's like, I don't know, is there more than 100 owners each having like a small vineyard row or even less of one row today?
Yeah, I don't know exactly how many owners there are, but this is the case all throughout Burgundy, really. And that's sort of what led to the négociant system, because you're absolutely right that the Napoleonic, code said, okay, we're no longer just going to pass it to the eldest son, but inheritance is going to be divided evenly among all children. That was 300 years ago. And you think about that continuing to be broken down year after year, it means that there's particular family members or families that have like one bush, like have one vine in the Clos de Vougeot or in, wherever. That's why these big companies called négociants come along now and they purchase fruit from all of these different families and businesses and are able to make wine in greater quantity because you really can't make much wine out of one row or a couple of different vines.
Sure, that makes sense. So let's talk about some of the famous religious folks who made major contributions. You've already mentioned Saint Vincent, patron saint of wine. Dom Pérignon, what is his contribution to wine in your opinion?
I mean, there's the mythology around him. He was, was it 17th century in Champagne around Epernay. The mythology is that he created sparkling wine, that he or sort of discovered it. He's got the myth is that he's in his cellar and he says, "Brothers, come quickly. I've invented the stars." It's a great story, but it's pretty much clearly a fabricated story by one of his later fans. Because truthfully, I think it was 7 years before that.
Fan fiction, the first fan fiction.
Oh yeah, there was way for centuries before that. All these famous monks all have these kind of hilarious legends around them. But it was actually, I think, 7 years before Dom Pérignon even started making wine or even being involved in his monastery in Villers or something like that, that an Englishman had sort of published a paper saying, here's how we can put molasses and sugar into wines we've gotten from France to create the sparkle. So Dom Pérignon absolutely did not create sparkling wine, but he actually was more involved, as far as I know, and it's been a while since I've thought about this, was very involved in pruning regimens and was much more sort of vigorous pruning to get higher quality wine. And he also, I think, invented blending, just again, trying to get a really high quality base wine rather than just pulling out of, particular blocks of particular vineyards. But he also really emphasized for a long time, red wine, Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier rather than Chardonnay, because he was trying to make still wines rather than sparkling wines. That was what he thought was the highest quality champagne had to offer at the time. And white wine like Chardonnay that was planted there, because the acid was so high in the white wine, would be more likely to create sparkle, because in the spring, the yeast that had gone to sleep in the winter would wake up and keep feasting on the residual sugar in white wine a lot more than red wine, which fermented a little bit faster. So yeah, not only did he not invent sparkling wine, but he actually for a long time was focused on creating still wines out of red varietals.
Huh. Yeah, I heard he was complaining about the bubbles, not trying to get them in there, but that's interesting. And then John the Baptist, why is he known as the patron saint of the cellar?
Yeah, it's because in the Gospels, it was King Herod, I forget which King Herod, threw him in the dungeon because John the Baptist was speaking truth to power. He was like married to his sister or something like that. And John the Baptist wasn't cool with that. So he got thrown into the dungeon of the palace and eventually beheaded. And so because he was in the dungeon, he became the patron saint of cellar masters.
Okay. So you talk about there's a debate as well that you mentioned between geologists and sommeliers. Can you really taste the soil and minerals? I mean, where do you come down on that? Because a rock is not going to go through the organic process up a vine and out into your glass, but where do you net out?
I don't know. I sort of had fun with that in the book. I think it's a bit of a tempest in a teapot, but everyone always has to have something to debate about in every field. And I find a fascinating debate. I've read a bunch of different things on it. The sommeliers will say, I can taste the soil in, Chablis or Sancerre, or I can taste the slate in a Mosel Riesling, etc. And then the geologist will say, actually, that's impossible. There's no way for vines to metabolize rock to the extent that then they actually deposit those aromas and flavors into their fruit and create wine that tastes like the soil. But I think there's probably a lot more conversation to be had around that. But the question is always, if that's true, then why is it? Then is it just analogy, or is it just enough people have said they can taste the chalk from Chablis, that Kimmeridgian soil in the wines, that therefore now we're all sort of persuaded that that's what we're tasting. And they're trying to describe non-fruity components of the wine and, so the heralded minerality of Chablis and Sancerre and whatnot. I think it's kind of a funny debate. After being in hospice for 8 years, I find sort of the idea that people are really up in arms about whether you can taste rocks and wine from a scientific point of view. I find it kind of funny, but it's still kind of a fascinating topic.
First world problems, yes.
Yeah, it's extremely first world problems, but it's an ongoing debate, and I sort of make light of it a little bit, but I actually find it pretty interesting.
And so why did you choose to go to, I think I mispronounced it earlier, but the Santa Ynez Valley in Santa Barbara
Ynez
County?
Valley.
Why there versus Ynez?
The easy answer is it's 2.5 hours away from where I lived, and Napa is about 8 hours away from where I lived. And the other easy answer to that is there was a movie that many people have heard of called Sideways that actually introduced me for the first time to the Santa Ynez Valley. I was living east of Pasadena, about, I guess, maybe 3 hours away from Santa Ynez. And this movie in 2004 comes out starring Paul Giamatti that is set and filmed in the Santa Ynez Valley. And it's kind of a dark comedy, but it's sort of a sad and comedy in a lot of ways, but still it won an Academy Award for the screenplay. But I was so taken at the time with the way this valley, I say this valley because I live here now, was portrayed, and just kind of this bucolic, beautiful, wild, rural area. I was so taken with that I knew I had to come up and visit as soon as I saw that movie. And that's one of the only movies in my life I've ever seen more than one time in the theater. I saw it twice in the theater. And probably 3 weeks after I first saw the movie, I drove up here to Santa Ynez, and I just fell in love, from the very beginning. It was so different. I'd been to Napa a couple of times, which to me always seemed so opulent and decadent and polished and, incredible. But Santa Ynez felt like the wine backcountry to me. Kind of felt like you were hiking into the backcountry and you were tasting Pinot back in the day out of corrugated shacks and old barns. And I really loved the wine. They're a little bit more reserved.
And do you think the wines of the region are undervalued?
I was going to say, I really love the wines. I felt like they were a little bit more reserved in nature than some of the kind of the big blockbuster cabs of Napa or Paso Robles. And I don't know if they're undervalued. I mean, I feel like this valley now at this point has been very much discovered by Los Angeles. And we've seen big changes in the last 2 or 3 years with COVID and a lot of LA refugees moving up here, like I once was. And I think there's a certain reserve, a certain kind of coyness to the style of wine around here that I really appreciate, that there's more delicacy to our style here because of a pretty cool climate. I very much love the wines here. If I'm not drinking French wines, I'm absolutely drinking Pinot Noir out of the Santa Rita Hills.
Hmm. And so if we're planning a trip to your region, what are your top tips on getting the most from our visit there?
I would say search out the small producers. And there's not too many big producers here, but the ones that if you just Google wineries of the Santa Ynez Valley, you're going to get some of the bigger, sort of more photogenic ones. I think 80 something percent of the wineries in this area are made by family owned wineries who make fewer than 10,000 cases a year. And those to me are the hidden gems of this valley. And so I would search out producers like Story of Soil and Dragonette and Future Perfect more than I would some of the bigger, more sort of TikTok oriented wineries. And I would probably stay in Solvang, which is this funny little Danish enclave that was established a little over 100 years ago that was sort of built. It sounds super kitschy, and it kind of is, but at the same time, it's really charming and lovely, especially at Christmas time because they really do it up. But it's this town of half-timbered buildings and windmills and stork's nests and very authentic Danish bakeries. And it's a good home base for exploring the region. So those are a couple of the things that I would say. Find the small producers and explore Solvang a little bit.
Great. Excellent. All right. So before we jump into the lightning round, many people who've written a memoir say they did it because others reading their stories will feel less alone. I'm asking you this selfishly too, because I've just finished my own memoir. So how do you dig deeper into that phrase? What does it mean specifically that you want to share your story, which is unique to you, but when others read it, they'll feel less alone?
I just think ultimately the point of writing a story that's going to be for public consumption is that, for me anyway, the hope is that people will connect with it. I want people to hear a little bit of their own story in my story because we're all humans and we have so much in common. And we all have had grief and loss and transitions and career change. And many of us have been through divorces and lots, life pains. And, there's a real vulnerability to writing a memoir where you really lay out process by which you arrived somewhere. It's one thing to talk about, well, now I'm here in the Santa Ynez Valley and I drink, really good wine and I work in the wine industry and life is awesome. But the process to get here was so painful. And when you're revealing that process, I think that's when you're hoping for deep human connection. And so the hope is that people will, even if they don't relate to the details of the story, will relate to the process and the emotions and struggles. And I've already had this, I've gotten great response from a few people that are just like, yeah, you've inspired me to take this step. Or I laughed and I cried through your story because it reminded me of, I guess ultimately, I don't think I'm ever going to write blockbuster New York Times bestselling books, but I think ultimately you hope that people will feel less alone, that they'll connect.
Yeah, it's the transition they identify, not the specific change. So they didn't move to Santa Ynez, but they might have moved place, as you said, changed career, got divorced. Like it's what happened, the transition and how you felt and how you dealt with it. The specifics of you were married to so and, you had a job here is not so much the story, but what happened and how you dealt with it. Well, you've been leading me along here. I love your whole change transition analogy. So I'm processing because I've got to figure it out for myself too. So, what is your greatest satisfaction having written the book now?
This is my third book. And for me, the moment that means everything, and I know you publish books too, and I'm sure you had this experience, is that the moment the box of books show up about a month before book release, that to me is like the moment that I live for. It's before it's gone out into the world, before the critics and the reviewers have gotten a piece of it. And you just get to sit there with your creation that always, I love the texture of the book that my publisher chose. It has this very vintage feel to it. And you just hold it in your hands and you just feel it. And you just remember all the agony and torture that's gone into that little thing in your hand. And that to me is what I live for. That's the moment. And then after that, it goes out into the world and it feels like you're sort of like dropping off your kid at college and you hope that you taught the kid well and that they're going to go and make good choices, because then it sort of like feels at that moment like you let it go in a lot of ways, and you just don't control what's going to happen to it or what people are going to say about it after that. But that one moment is like your moment with the book.
Yeah, I love that. And, you know, there's so many great unboxing videos on social media, but I think it's that element of it's real. It's like you've been Geppetto all along to this book, and now it's a real boy. It's a real child. It's, you know. So let's go into the lightning round. Just a few quick questions, quick answers. Is there something you believe about wine with which others might disagree with you?
I believe it to be a very spiritual thing. I believe it to be not only a beverage that we can enjoy, but something that may actually sort of lift our minds towards higher thoughts. And
Beautiful. Do you have a favorite wine book?
Karen McNeil's book, The Wine Bible, hands down. She has a new edition out, which looks beautiful. And what I love about Karen is that not only that she knows everything in the world about wine, but she's just an incredibly good writer. And I appreciate that, because we all know there are a lot of wine books that are pretty dry. And she's a really good writer. The idea that champagne is like a sword enveloped in whipped cream, you know, things like that. Just incredibly good writing.
Wow, I love that. I didn't hear that one. And do you have a most useful wine gadget you've discovered along the way?
Oh, I don't know if I have too many wine gadgets. I like my Coravan for sure. When you live in the wine country, there's far too much free wine out there, and it's very easy to drink too much. And so the Coravan helps me to just keep it to one glass a night. Although I'm not always convinced it keeps wine for more than a few days. But yeah, preservation system is key when people are giving you too much free wine.
Exactly. Preservation for the human body, too.
Yes.
So tell me about a bad wine pairing you've had. I think you might have mentioned a chicken picante, but I'm not sure. What is that dish, by the way? I'm not quite even sure what it is.
Chicken piccata. It's basically
piccata.
a breaded chicken and like a lemon caper sauce. It's delicious. You know, I've always heard, this was years ago, but I'd always heard like the best wine is the one that you want and the best dish is the one that you enjoy. And so don't worry about, you know, sort of pairing wine and food together. And so I sort of tested that theory. This was 20 years ago when I really loved Australian Shiraz, you know, big, jammy, intense Australian Shiraz, which now isn't necessarily the case. And then I paired it with chicken piccata, which is the absolute worst pairing I've ever had in my entire life. And it basically just sort of, I had friends over and that's what I served. And I'm still kind of embarrassed about that. And it just kind of ruined everything. And that's when I was like, okay, I think I need to think a little bit more carefully about this whole idea of pairing food and wine.
And do you have a great wine pairing? You're talking about maybe something about duck fat and a chewy wine?
Yeah. That's what I talk about in the book. You know, just the notion that if you're going to have a really tannic wine, instead of having it suck all the proteins out of your saliva, you want to put some good marbled fat in there to soften it all out. And, you know, the wine will cleanse your palate of the food and the food will cleanse your palate of the wine. But lately, I'm having a weird Chardonnay phase right now where I'm really loving the Chardonnays, especially of the Santa Ynez Valley, which tend to be lighter and kind of saltier than some other styles. And I'm really into like Chardonnay from the Santa Rita Hills and Julia Child's roast chicken recipe right now, which she's slathered in butter. So how bad can it be, right? But this sort of butter slathered roast chicken with that crispy skin, along with like a clean, fresh, pure style of Chardonnay is like my favorite go-to pairing right now.
Oh, yeah. I loved her free spirit. Doesn't matter if you drop the chicken on the floor, keep going.
Amazing woman. Amazing
great.
woman.
She was, wasn't she? So if you could share a bottle of wine with anyone outside the wine world, who would that be? And what would you ask? What bottle would it be?
That's a really hard question for me to answer. Ever since I moved to the central coast of California, I've pretty much been reading John Steinbeck ever since. He lived up in Salinas, which is about 3 hours north of where I am. And the way that he portrays the central coast of California is what I aspire to do. I talk a lot about place in the book, and I try to describe a lot of the landscape and seascapes of this valley. But, you know, he's the master. He's the muse of all writers trying to write about the Central Coast. And I think I would just love to sit with him. I don't know if he was a wine drinker, probably not, but I would love to sit with him and just talk about writing. I'd like to know how he did it, what he sees. I'd like to see sort of this valley in the Central Coast through his eyes and his ears.
Well, he wrote Grapes of Wrath, right?
Exactly. Yeah, he did. Although that wasn't as much based here, but like his East of Eden book or Tortilla Flats and Cannery Row were all based up in Monterey and the Central Coast. And I wish that I could describe this area with the words and the pith that he does. He had a magic pen for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of pith, if you could put up a billboard in downtown San Francisco, what would it say?
You don't have to have 27 different ways to drink coffee. Every time I go to
thought it'd be wine related.
Every time I go to San Francisco and you walk into a coffee shop and it's like a freaking science experiment in there. And I'm like, I just want drip coffee. I don't want it run through a funnel. Like I just I get so overwhelmed by coffee shops in San Francisco.
Okay. Well, yes, that'd be good. And also maybe a little side note, buy my book.
Yeah.
But given your expertise, which wine would you like served at your funeral?
Probably trying to think of something funny or metaphorical to say, but I don't really have anything. Probably Chateauneuf du Pape, because that was, the eye-opening experience for me, and probably like in terms of meaning, the central wine in my experience and what led me to get into wine and pursue this calling of writing in wine. So probably Chateauneuf du Pape, probably Chateau de Beaucastel from Chateauneuf du Pape.
Ooh, that's a great choice. Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up our conversation, is there anything we haven't covered that you wanted to mention?
People just sort of ask me, exactly like what the book is about. And the way that I put it is for 8 to 10 years, I used to work in the Pasadena area as a hospice chaplain and grief counselor. And now I live in the Santa Ynez Valley and I'm a sommelier and I work in the wine industry and I'm a wine tour guide as well. And Blood from a Stone, and the name of the book, is how I got from there to here, essentially. That's sort of my elevator speech about my book.
Well done, well refined. So where can people find you and your book online, and I presume in bookstores, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's all over the interwebs, of course, and hopefully in a lot of local bookstores. I'm all about supporting local bookstores. And if you come to the Santa Ynez Valley, it's all over the place here. There's various wineries that are carrying it. And I don't have a website, but if you want to contact me, and please do, you can email me at adammchugh@gmail.com or find me on Instagram at adammchugh.wine.
Excellent, Adam. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Great conversation. I could keep going on another hour with you, but we both have to resurrect ourselves probably with a glass of wine by that time. But thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing our conversation perhaps in another episode down the road.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Natalie. It was fun.
Okay. I'll say bye for now. Cheers, Adam.
Cheers.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed my chat with Adam. Here are my takeaways. Number 1, I loved how Adam wove in the stories of John the Baptist and Dom Pérignon and Saint Vincent, all as they relate to wine. And I agree with him that wine can be a spiritual thing apart from its religious associations. Clos de Vougeot in Burgundy is such a storied vineyard. I'm glad he included it in his book. The Santa Ynez wine region in Santa Barbara County is on my radar to visit next. It's incredible that over 80% of wines from Santa Ynez are made by family-owned wineries that make less than 10,000 cases yearly. That's tiny in the world of wine. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, a full transcript of my conversation with Adam, links to his website and book, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. You'll also find a link to my ultimate guide to wine and food pairing. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/222. Email me if you have a sip, tip, or would like to become an early reader of my new memoir at natalie@nataliemclean.com. If you missed episode 52, go back and take a listen. I chat with Matt Cause about visiting Burgundy and tasting Barolo. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. I'm asking the questions the reader would love to ask, but that person is not going to get in to see Domaine Romanée-Conti. And the only reason, by the way, Matt, that I would get in to see Domaine Romanée-Conti is that Aubert de Villaine and his like recognize how many readers I bring with me. It's not me, it's the readership that I bring with me. And so I'm trying to ask the questions they'd be dying to ask. And even if they were there, maybe they'd be too embarrassed to ask. So I'm a very, very nosy person, but I'm also very shy. And so writing has given me the cover of being able to ask people things like, well, what is your greatest failure? What'd you learn from it? Those kinds of things that can be uncomfortable if you just sort of turned to someone at a dinner party and started down that road. If you liked this episode, please email or tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines, tips, and stories we shared. You won't want to miss next week when I chat with Stephen Lane, author of the wine thriller Root Cause. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a lovely glass of Burgundy, Clos de Vougeot if you're lucky, or rich, or both. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.